December the 3rd, 1944. 2:17 in the morning. The medical tent at Camp 185 smelled of carbolic soap and damp canvas. Rain drummed on the roof. A single oil lamp flickered against the darkness. Matthias Brenner lay on a British Army cot, chest burning with every breath. 29 years old. 178 centimeters tall. 61 kilograms, down from 79 in June. His body shook with fever. Temperature, 40.1 degrees Celsius. On the metal tray beside him sat a small bottle. Sulfa drugs. Worth more than gold in wartime Europe. Dr. Patterson stood over him, stethoscope cold against burning skin. Pneumonia, the doctor said to the nurse. Bilateral infiltrates. Without treatment, he's dead in 48 hours. Matthias heard the words through fever haze. His German was good enough to catch the English. Dead in 48 hours. Why would they waste medicine on a German prisoner? The nurse, Margaret, her name tag read, adjusted the oxygen tent with gentle, professional hands. We'll start the sulfa protocol, Dr. Patterson said. Every 4 hours. Monitor vitals. Matthias tried to speak. His throat closed around the words. The doctor looked down at him. No hatred in his eyes. No satisfaction. Just calm assessment. You're going to fight this, Dr. Patterson said in accented German. And we're going to help you fight it. Matthias's last clear thought before delirium took him, this makes no sense. 6 weeks earlier, he'd expected torture. October the 12th, 1944. 6:40 in the morning. A railway siding in Yorkshire, England wrapped in drizzling rain that turned the world grey and cold. Matthias Brenner stepped down from the cattle car into mud that sucked at his boots. His hands were bound with rope. 3 days of transport across the channel and through the English countryside. The rope had worn his wrists raw. Around him, 200 German prisoners shuffled into formation. Men from the 352nd Infantry Division. Captured after weeks of brutal fighting in Normandy. Each one expecting the worst. The propaganda had been explicit. Crystal clear. The British Empire, built on centuries of colonial brutality, would show no mercy to German prisoners. Expect beatings. Expect starvation. Expect forced labor until death claimed you. Better to die fighting than face what the British would do to captured soldiers. Matthias looked around for the brutality he'd been promised. Instead, he saw order. British guards stood in neat formations. Rifles held properly. Uniforms clean despite the weather. No shouting. No chaos. Just quiet, professional military discipline. A British sergeant approached, middle-aged with a steady gaze that suggested he'd seen everything war could offer. He spoke in accented but comprehensible German, each word measured and clear. You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp. Anyone who causes trouble will be disciplined. Anyone who cooperates will be treated correctly. Is this understood? The tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It was simply matter of fact. Soldiers addressing soldiers. Matthias found himself nodding before he realized he was taking orders from the enemy. The search was thorough but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued and stored in cloth bags, each tagged with a number. Wounded prisoners were separated for immediate medical attention, helped onto stretchers by British medics who worked with clinical efficiency. Then came water. British soldiers moving down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who'd been their enemies just days earlier. Matthias drank. The water was cold and clean, cutting through the dust that had lined his throat since Normandy. He drank and realized with uncomfortable clarity that his first experience of British captivity contradicted every warning he'd received. As trucks arrived to transport them to camp, Matthias overheard 2 British guards talking. He understood only fragments. Enough. One said something about poor bastards. The other replied with words Matthias would remember for the rest of his life, Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly. Camp 185 sat in Lancashire, surrounded by farmland that stretched to distant hills. The facility held approximately 2,000 prisoners in wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. Barbed wire. Guard towers. Nothing luxurious, but weatherproof, organized, clean. Processing was systematic. A British clerk recording Matthias's name, rank, unit, hometown in careful handwriting. Medical examination next. A doctor checking for disease, wounds, examining eyes and teeth and lungs with the same professional detachment he might show a British soldier. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding large numbers of German prisoners. They'd prepared accordingly. Built camps. Trained guards. Established procedures. This wasn't improvised revenge. This was organized detention planned and executed with typical British thoroughness. The first meal arrived at 6 in the evening. Matthias had expected starvation rations. The propaganda had promised that British captors would deliberately starve German prisoners, let them waste away on bread and water. Instead, dinner came in metal bowls carried by prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, supervised by British guards who ensured equal portions. Matthias stared at his bowl. Brown stew with chunks of actual meat. Not sawdust. Not potato peel. Real beef, dark and fibrous, swimming in gravy thick with fat. The smell hit him first, rich and savory, making his stomach clench with hunger he'd been ignoring for weeks. Carrots cut in rough pieces. Potatoes with their skins still on, soft and steaming. Bread came next. Real wheat bread. Not the sawdust-mixed substitute the Wehrmacht had been issuing during those final weeks in Normandy. The crust crackled when he broke it. The inside was soft, almost white. Margarine. A pat of it, yellow and soft. Tea, hot and strong, with sugar available in small portions. Matthias ate slowly, paying attention to each bite. The beef was tough, required chewing, but it was beef. Real protein. Real fat coating his tongue. Warmth spreading through his chest. More food than his unit had been receiving in weeks. More food than he'd seen since before the invasion. According to National Archives reference W0165/40231, the daily calorie allocation for working prisoners of war was 2,800 calories. More than adequate for survival. Across the barracks, a prisoner named Klaus Weber spoke quietly. 34 years old, hard features, true believer. They're fattening us for slave labor. Give us strength before they work us to death. Others nodded. It made sense according to the propaganda they'd absorbed. Everything the British did must have sinister purpose. Matthias said nothing. He just ate and observed. That night, sleeping in a real bed with a thin mattress and 2 wool blankets, in a barracks that didn't leak, listening to rain drum on a solid roof, Matthias lay awake. He'd been captured 72 hours ago. In that time, he'd been searched but not beaten. Fed adequately. Given medical examination. Housed properly. Treated with firm but professional courtesy by guards who showed no particular hatred. The disconnect between expectation and reality was so profound that part of him waited for the other shoe to drop. But another part of him, the part that had been a teacher before the war, the part that observed and analyzed and looked for patterns, that part was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. What if the propaganda had been wrong? The next morning began at 6. A British guard walking through the barracks, not shouting, speaking in clear German. Aufstehen. Breakfast in 30 minutes. Work assignments after. Breakfast was porridge, thick oatmeal with a splash of milk, a spoonful of sugar if you wanted it. Bread. Margarine. Tea. Simple food, but adequate, hot, filling. Then came the rules, posted on the barracks wall in German, explained by a British officer who spoke the language with precision. Work assignments mandatory unless medically excused. Cooperation required. Defiance punished. Medical care provided to all prisoners. Religious services permitted upon request. Letter writing allowed under censorship. Discipline maintained through orderly procedures according to Geneva Convention standards. The rules weren't kind, but they were fair, applied equally to all prisoners without favoritism or arbitrary cruelty. Matthias was assigned to agricultural work. Group 7. 20 prisoners transported daily to local farms that needed labor. Britain faced severe worker shortages with millions of men in military service. German prisoners of war provided essential workforce for agriculture and basic construction. The truck delivered them to a farm in Lancashire, 20 miles from the camp, owned by a man named William Thornton. 64 years old, deeply lined face creased by decades of outdoor work, hands like leather from a lifetime of labor. He watched the prisoners unload with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Not aimed. Not threatening. Just present. A reminder. The work was exactly what they'd been told. Harvesting turnips. Repairing fences. Mucking out stables. Hard physical labor that left Matthias's back aching and his hands blistered. He'd been a teacher before conscription, spent his days with books and students, not with shovels and turnip rows. But the work wasn't impossible. The hours were genuinely 8, with a lunch break at midday. Farmer Thornton remained distant that first week, watching from a distance, the shotgun always nearby. But he wasn't cruel. When the corporal started to yell at a prisoner who'd misunderstood an instruction, Thornton intervened. "That won't help, Corporal. Show him properly. He'll learn faster from demonstration than from shouting." The corporal colored slightly but complied. Matthias noticed. He noticed everything. On his 5th day in captivity, Matthias met another prisoner who would become important. Oscar Dietrich. 32 years old. Captured at the same time as Matthias. Before the war, he'd been a clerk in Munich, a man who worked with numbers and forms, who understood systems and bureaucracy. They worked the same detail on Thornton's farm, pulling turnips from cold mud while autumn rain fell steadily. "You notice it too?" Oscar said quietly during a water break. "The fairness." "I notice they haven't beaten us," Matthias replied carefully. "More than that. The systematic nature of it. This isn't kindness. This is policy, implemented from the top down with typical British thoroughness." Oscar pulled another turnip, examined it, tossed it in the cart. "They're treating us well because they believe it proves something. About themselves. About their civilization versus ours. Does it prove anything?" Oscar smiled without humor. "I've been here 3 weeks longer than you. I developed dysentery my first week. The British doctor treated me with the same medicines, the same care he'd give a British soldier. Sulfa drugs. Clean water. Bed rest. I would have died without proper treatment. He saved my life." He paused. An enemy doctor saving an enemy prisoner's life because that's what his professional ethics demanded. Matthias worked in silence for a moment, processing this. "That's what I don't understand. Why waste resources on enemies?" "Because they're not like us," Oscar said quietly. "We were told they were barbaric colonial oppressors who ruled through violence. Instead, I'm finding they have moral standards they actually follow. Even when it costs them. Even when no one's watching." Another pause. "It's making me question what else we were told that wasn't true." That conversation planted seeds that would grow throughout Matthias's captivity. November the 15th. A young British guard, Corporal Mason, 22 years old, struck a German prisoner during an argument over work assignments. Not a severe beating. Just a single blow with his rifle but immediate and visible. Within minutes, Sergeant Major Richard Coleman appeared. 47 years old, the senior NCO at Camp 185, a man who carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd seen combat and survived it. His presence commanded attention without requiring raised voices. He pulled the young guard aside. The entire camp could hear every word. "Corporal Mason. You just violated military discipline by striking a prisoner. In the British Army, we maintain standards regardless of circumstance. These men are under our care. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness, not through violence." Mason tried to speak. Coleman cut him off. "I don't care what he was doing. You maintain control through proper procedure, not through losing your temper. You're reduced one rank effective immediately. You're reassigned to other duties. Dismissed." Then Coleman addressed the assembled prisoners in careful German. "The guard who struck you has been disciplined. He violated our standards. You will be treated correctly according to regulations. Not because you deserve it. Because we demand it of ourselves. Anyone who believes British discipline is weakness is invited to test that theory. You'll find we can be very firm indeed when necessary. But we will not lower ourselves to brutality. That's what separates us from what you fought for." Matthias stood among the other prisoners, watching this demonstration of British self-discipline. A guard had been punished for hitting an enemy prisoner, punished visibly, firmly, to prove a point. The point being, British standards applied even when dealing with enemies. Especially when dealing with enemies. That night, Matthias sat in the barracks writing a letter home. The camp allowed letters under censorship, one per week, no military information permitted. He'd written to his wife Greta twice already, careful letters saying he was alive and unharmed. This letter was different. "My dearest Greta. I write to you from Camp 185 in Lancashire. I am healthy. I am fed adequately. I receive medical care when ill. I work 8 hours daily on a farm, hard labor but not cruel. I am treated fairly according to Geneva Conventions. Everything we were told about British torture of prisoners was propaganda. Complete lies. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. I don't understand this yet, but I'm beginning to think we were lied to about many things. Not just about this. About everything." He sealed the letter, submitted it to the censor. It was approved and sent within 2 days. The following week brought Matthias's first real test of British medical care. The combination of cold November rain, hard physical labor, and a body weakened by weeks of poor rations in Normandy caught up with him. Pneumonia hit fast. November 28. Working Thornton's fields. Sudden fever. Chest tight. Each breath feeling like drowning. By evening, his temperature had spiked to 40.1 degrees Celsius. Which brought him to that medical tent at 2:17 in the morning on December 3rd. The fever raging. The sulfa drugs on the tray. Dr. Patterson's calm voice promising treatment. Nurse Margaret's gentle hands. "Will you let me die?" Matthias had asked through delirium. "I'm a doctor," Dr. Patterson had replied. "I don't let anyone die if I can help it. Medicine doesn't have nationality." 5 days of treatment followed. Sulfa tablets every 4 hours. British medical staff checking his temperature, 40.1 degrees, then 39.2, then 38.1, then 37.3. Broth and soft bread when he could eat. Nurse Margaret monitoring him constantly. On the 6th day, December 9th, the fever finally broke. Matthias woke clear-headed for the first time in a week. Weak but alive. Nurse Margaret smiled when she checked his temperature. "Welcome back. You gave us a bit of worry there." "Why?" Matthias asked, his English limited but functional. "Why save enemy?" She paused, considering the question seriously. Because you're a patient. That's all that matters in this tent. Patient and nurse. Not German and British. She moved on to check other patients, leaving Matthias to contemplate what he'd just experienced. December approached. Matthias had been in British captivity for 7 weeks. 7 weeks without beatings. 7 weeks with adequate food. 7 weeks of medical care when needed. 7 weeks of firm but fair treatment from guards who maintained discipline without descending into cruelty. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything the Nazi propaganda machine had told him about British brutality was proving false. Not slightly inaccurate. Not exaggerated. Completely, systematically false. Which raised the terrible question, what else had been lies? December the 24th. 7 in the evening. The recreation barracks at Camp 185 had been transformed. 200 German prisoners filled the wooden benches, men from shattered divisions who'd fought across Normandy and lost. Paper decorations hung from rafters, crude but carefully made. Stars cut from newspaper. Chains folded from scrap. A small wooden cross stood at the front, carved by a prisoner who'd been a carpenter in peacetime. Candles flickered in the cold air, their light warm against the darkness pressing at the windows. Outside, British guards stood in the December rain, not threatening, not invasive, just present, maintaining security while respecting the boundary between duty and dignity. Matthias Brenner stood near the front, holding a worn hymnal the British chaplain had provided. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, from the weight of what was about to happen. 200 men who'd believed Nazi propaganda about British barbarism, gathered to worship freely in an enemy prison camp, protected by guards who had every reason to hate them. The service began simply. A prayer. Scripture readings in German, the words familiar from childhood. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, the story of shepherds and angels and a child born in occupied territory under foreign rule. The parallels weren't lost on anyone. Hymns followed. O Tannenbaum. Es ist ein Rose entsprungen. Songs of hope in darkness. Songs of light persisting despite everything. Matthias listened to 200 German voices singing in a British prison camp and felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking. Opening, like ice splitting in spring thaw. The final hymn approached. Matthias moved to the front, the hymnal heavy in his hands. Oscar Dietrich stood beside him. Together they led the opening notes. Still Nacht. Silent Night. Holy Night. The song that every German child learned before they could read. The song that transcended politics and ideology and national boundaries. The song that for 3 minutes made everyone human again. Matthias sang. 200 voices joined him. The German words drifted through the barracks, through the walls, out into the cold Yorkshire night where British guards stood in the rain listening. The melody, simple and achingly beautiful, carried across the camp. Sleep in heavenly peace. Sleep in heavenly peace. Matthias's voice cracked on the second verse. He wasn't alone. Around him, men were crying openly, not from sadness, from the recognition of something they'd forgotten existed. Beauty. Peace. The possibility of grace even in the machinery of war. When the final note faded, silence filled the barracks, complete and profound. 200 men holding their breath, holding this moment before reality crashed back. Then from outside, unexpected sound. Applause. British guards clapping, slow at first, then building. Not mocking. Not ironic. Genuine appreciation for something they'd witnessed, for beauty they'd recognized despite the barbed wire and guard towers and brutal context of captivity. The barracks door opened. Sergeant Major Richard Coleman entered, water dripping from his uniform, his face unreadable but his eyes reflecting the candlelight. He spoke in careful German, each word chosen deliberately. Gentlemen. War has taken much from all of us. Our homes. Our friends. Our certainties about how the world works. Tonight we remember what remains. The things war can't destroy if we don't let it. Faith. Hope. The possibility of peace. He paused. Happy Christmas. Behind him, younger guards entered carrying wooden boxes, distributing cigarettes and biscuits. Not regulation rations. Personal gestures. Small offerings given freely across enemy lines. A young prisoner, Eric, 19 years old with a baby face, broke down completely, shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't control. Oscar moved to him, put an arm around his shoulders. "They're supposed to be monsters," Eric said between gasps. "Berlin told us they were monsters. Why are they being kind? Why?" Oscar held him while he cried, and around them, other prisoners wrestled with the same question. The cognitive dissonance of experiencing mercy from enemies. The collapse of propaganda meeting the reality of systematic human decency. Matthias watched Coleman distributing cigarettes, watched British guards treating German prisoners with careful respect, and understood something fundamental. This wasn't kindness. This was ideology manifesting in action. British democracy proving itself not through words but through behavior. Treating defeated enemies with dignity to demonstrate that civilization meant something real, something measurable in human interactions. The Nazi propaganda had taught that democracy was weak, that only authoritarian strength could impose order, that mercy was vulnerability to be exploited. But here in this barracks, on this Christmas Eve, Matthias saw strength that didn't require cruelty. Order maintained through professionalism instead of terror. Mercy given not from weakness but from confidence in moral superiority. It was devastating, more devastating than military defeat, because it proved that everything they'd believed, everything they'd fought for, had been built on lies. After the service ended and prisoners returned to their barracks, Matthias sat alone for a long time, staring at nothing. Oscar found him there. "You're thinking too much," Oscar said, sitting on the adjacent bunk. "We were the barbarians," Matthias said quietly. "Not them. Us." "Yes. How do we live with that? How do we go home after this and face what we were part of?" Oscar was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe we don't go home. Maybe we build something different." The next morning brought Christmas dinner. Roasted goose carved in the camp kitchen. Portions smaller than pre-war Christmases but real poultry nonetheless. The meat was dark and rich, the skin crispy with rendered fat. Golden potatoes roasted until crisp. Braised carrots and parsnips glazed with something sweet. Plum pudding for dessert, dense and dark, studded with dried fruit. Oranges came last. Real citrus fruit, bright and impossible. Matthias held his orange for a full minute before peeling it, just looking at the color. Orange, vivid and alive. He hadn't seen that color in food for 2 years. When he bit into the first piece, juice burst across his tongue, sweet and sharp and so intensely flavored that tears came to his eyes. January arrived with bitter cold and the continuation of work that had become routine. Matthias's detail still went to Thornton's farm daily, still harvested frozen vegetables and repaired buildings damaged by winter storms. William Thornton had thawed considerably since October. The shotgun no longer appeared. The old farmer worked alongside the prisoners now, demonstrating techniques, correcting errors without anger. One frozen morning in late January, Thornton stood with Matthias examining a collapsed section of stone wall that needed rebuilding. "You're good with geometry," Thornton said, handing Matthias a measuring tape. "Teacher's mind. You see the angles." "I taught Latin," Matthias replied, measuring the gap. "But yes. Structure is structure." They worked in silence for a while, selecting stones, testing fits. "What will you do after the war?" Thornton asked. The question assumed Matthias would survive to see after the war. Assumed there would be an after. "I don't know. Return to Germany," I suppose. If there's anything left to return to. Thornton was quiet for a moment, selecting stones for the repair. I'll need workers when this ends. Farm's too much for an old man alone. If you wanted, there'd be a place here. Proper wages. Housing. Bring your family when Germany allows. Matthias stared at him. You'd employ me? After everything? You're a good worker. Honest. Better than some British lads I've hired. Thornton fitted a stone into place, tested its stability. War's not your fault any more than it's mine. We're just men trying to survive what the politicians created. He paused, looking out over the frozen fields. Besides, my son would have wanted it this way. He didn't die so I could spend the rest of my life hating. The offer hung in the cold air like visible breath. A future. An alternative to returning to destroyed Germany. To facing the ruins of everything he'd believed. Matthias didn't answer immediately, just worked beside Thornton, rebuilding the wall stone by stone, thinking about foundations and futures and the possibility of building something new on the rubble of ideology. February passed. Then March. Spring approached but hadn't yet arrived. The war news filtered into camp through official channels. Germany retreating on all fronts. The Eastern armies collapsing. The Western defenses crumbling. Everyone knew how it would end. Only the timing remained uncertain. April the 25th, 1945. British authorities assembled all prisoners at Camp 185 in the recreation barracks. Mandatory attendance. No exceptions. What followed would shatter whatever remained of Matthias's faith in the regime he'd fought for. Coleman spoke first, in German. What you're about to see was filmed by British and American forces during the liberation of German concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, liberated April 15. Buchenwald, liberated April 11. This footage is real. It has not been altered or staged. You will watch it in its entirety. The lights went out. The projector started. What appeared on the screen defied comprehension. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Thousands of them. Skeletal forms in striped uniforms. Mass graves being dug by bulldozers because there were too many dead to bury individually. Living prisoners, if you could call them living. Average weight 35 to 40 kilograms. Matthias had weighed 61 kilograms when captured. These prisoners weighed less than children. Their eyes had seen things that destroyed the soul. British soldiers in the frame, some of them vomiting. The smell must have been unspeakable. The reality of what they'd discovered overwhelming their training and discipline. The camera didn't look away. It recorded everything. The evidence. The testimony. The undeniable proof of industrialized murder on a scale that made warfare seem almost clean by comparison. The film ran for 20 minutes. No one in the barracks spoke. When it ended and the lights came on, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then Klaus Weber stood up, 34 years old, hard features set in denial. Propaganda. His voice was too loud, too desperate. Allied lies. Staged footage designed to justify their war. Some prisoners nodded, wanting to believe him, needing to believe him. But most sat frozen, unable to process, unable to deny. Oscar Dietrich sat crying, tears running down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. We did this, Oscar whispered. We fought for this. We killed and died to protect this. Matthias couldn't speak. His throat had closed. His mind refused to process what his eyes had seen. This was what British restraint had defeated. This was what Sergeant Major Coleman's systematic fairness stood against. This was the regime Matthias had served, had believed in, had fought to preserve. That night, Matthias vomited his dinner. Not from illness. From moral nausea. From understanding finally and completely what he'd been part of. Oscar found him behind the barracks, doubled over, dry heaving. "We can't go back," Oscar said quietly. "Not to that. Not to being part of that." Matthias wiped his mouth, straightened slowly. "Thornton offered me work. That's desertion. Betrayal of Germany." "Germany betrayed itself," Oscar said with sudden anger. "Germany betrayed everything civilization means. I won't be part of that anymore. I won't go home and pretend I didn't know." The camp divided into two factions after that. Klaus Weber led those who refused to believe, who insisted the footage was propaganda, who maintained loyalty to Germany despite everything, who planned to return home as soon as repatriation began. Matthias and Oscar led no one, but others gravitated toward them. Men who'd seen the newsreel and couldn't unsee it. Who understood what they'd been fighting for. Who felt the weight of complicity crushing them. One night in early May, Klaus confronted Matthias directly. "You're betraying the fatherland," Klaus said, voice hard. "Thinking about staying here. Abandoning your people." "The fatherland betrayed itself," Matthias replied. "It betrayed everything civilization means. So you'll become British? Abandon everything you are?" "I'll become whatever lets me sleep at night. Whatever lets me face my children without lying about what I was part of." Oscar intervened. "Our people built death camps. Our people murdered millions. Children. Families. Systematically. Industrially. I won't be part of that anymore." Klaus turned away, disgusted. "You're cowards. Both of you." "Maybe," Matthias said. "But we're cowards who've seen the truth." A letter arrived for Matthias in mid-March, via Red Cross, forwarded through official channels. Weeks old but intact. His hands shook opening it. "My dearest Matthias. Hamburg is destroyed. We survive at my sister's cottage outside the city. There is no work. Little food. No future here that I can see. Your letters reached me, all of them. I understand your shame. I share it. We believed lies. We supported evil. We must live with that knowledge. If you have chance for new life in Britain, I understand. The children need their father. I need my husband. Germany is dead. We must live. Your Greta." Matthias read the letter 3 times. Relief and grief tangled so tightly he couldn't separate them. She understood. She forgave. She was willing to come. He had permission to choose life over ideology. The offer came formally in early April. Thornton called Matthias into his farmhouse office. The room smelled of old wood and pipe tobacco. "I've been thinking about what I said in January," Thornton began, direct as always. "About employment after the war. I want to make it official." He produced papers, simple contract terms written in clear English. Civilian employment. £3 per week. Standard agricultural wages. Cottage on farm property. 2 rooms down, 2 up. When British authorities allow family reunification, bring your wife and children. "Why?" Matthias asked. "Why offer this to me?" "Because you're a good worker. Because I need someone reliable. Because you understand the land." Thornton leaned back in his chair. "I'm 64 years old. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. I need someone who'll care for it properly." He paused. "My son Robert died at the Somme in 1916. He was 19 years old. I spent 26 years hating every German who drew breath. But Robert wrote me letters from France before he died. He talked about the German soldiers they captured. Said they were just scared boys like him. Said the real enemy was the men who started wars, not the men who fought them." Thornton looked directly at Matthias. "I think he was right. War's not your fault any more than it was his. You're just men caught in the machinery. May the 7th, 1945. 11 in the morning. Coleman assembled all 2,000 prisoners in the main yard. Coleman's voice carried across the assembly without shouting, clear and firm and absolutely certain. Gentlemen. The war in Europe has ended. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You are now prisoners of a defeated nation. Repatriation will begin when conditions in Germany allow for safe return. Until then, camp routine continues. Those who wish may volunteer for continued agricultural work under civilian contracts with British farmers. He paused. That is all. The war was over. They'd survived it. Germany had lost everything. And they were standing in a British prison camp, adequately fed and fairly treated, facing a choice about what came next. Matthias stood among 2,000 German prisoners and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because Germany lost, but because the machinery had finally stopped. Klaus Weber announced his decision that afternoon, loudly, for everyone to hear. I'm returning to Germany. As soon as repatriation begins. Anyone with honor will do the same. Oskar announced his decision just as loudly. I'm staying. My family died in the Hamburg firebombing in March. There's nothing to return to. Matthias waited 3 months for Greta's decisive letter. It arrived in August, via Red Cross. My darling. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. I don't know if Hamburg still exists as anything recognizable. But I know this, you've been offered civilian work there. I'm not asking you to abandon Germany. I'm asking you to choose life. What should you do? You should stay. You should build something clean. You should make a home for us. And when they allow it, we will come to you. Because Germany is dead. And we must live. Your Greta. Matthias signed the papers in June, officially transitioning from prisoner of war to civilian agricultural worker employed by William Thornton. The change was bureaucratic, but its implications were enormous. He was choosing Britain. Choosing the enemy. Choosing mercy over loyalty to a defeated regime. Of the 2,000 prisoners at Camp 185, approximately 800 made the same choice. 40%. Not a majority, but a significant minority. Men choosing futures over ideologies. Choosing to build instead of returning to rubble. June the 14th, 1946. 14 months after the war's end. Matthias Brenner stood on the platform at Yorkshire Station, 31 years old now, wearing civilian clothes purchased with wages earned from honest agricultural labor. His hands were calloused from 18 months of farm work. His body had filled out. 68 kilograms. The morning train arrived carrying displaced persons. Refugees. Families reunited after years of separation. Then he saw them. Greta stepped down from the third carriage, 35 years old but looking older, her face lined by experiences he could only imagine. She wore a dress that had been mended multiple times, carried a single suitcase. Behind her, 2 children emerged. Stefan, 8 years old now, and Elise, 6 years old. Solemn-faced and quiet in the way children become when they've seen too much too young. Greta saw him. Stopped. For a moment they just looked at each other across 20 feet of platform, across the distance of war and separation and transformation. Then she moved, not running, walking with careful dignity, pulling the suitcase, guiding the children. Matthias met her halfway, took the suitcase from her hand, looked at his wife's face and saw everything she'd survived written there. You look healthy, Greta said quietly. British fed me well. He paused. You. We survived. That's what matters now. The children hung back, shy around this father they barely remembered. Matthias knelt to their level, making himself smaller, less threatening. I'm your father. I know you don't remember me well. That's all right. We'll have time now. All the time we need. Elise found her voice, small and uncertain. Are we English now? Or still German? The question hung in the morning air, impossibly complex, carrying weight no 6-year-old should have to bear. We're ourselves, Matthias said slowly. We're a family. That's all that matters. William Thornton waited by his truck at the station entrance. He'd driven Matthias to the station that morning, had offered to help collect the family without being asked. This is my family, Matthias said in English that had improved considerably. Greta, my wife. Stefan and Elise, my children. This is William Thornton. The farmer I work for. A good man. Thornton nodded to Greta, spoke slowly so she could follow. Welcome to Yorkshire, Mrs. Brenner. The cottage is ready. Small but sound. The cottage sat on Thornton's land. Stone walls 2 feet thick. Slate roof. 2 rooms downstairs and 2 up. A vegetable garden already planted, green shoots emerging from dark soil. Greta stood looking at it for a long moment. It's beautiful. Inside, the cottage smelled of whitewash and wood smoke, but it was clean. 2 beds upstairs. Table and chairs downstairs. A stove for cooking and heating. The children explored cautiously, touching walls, testing floorboards, claiming the small upstairs room as theirs with the tentative hope of refugees who'd learned not to trust permanence. Greta set down her suitcase, looked around the main room, and began to cry. Not dramatically. Just tears running down her face while she stood very still, shoulders shaking slightly. Matthias moved to her. She held up a hand, stopping him. I'm not sad, she said through tears. I'm relieved. We have walls. A roof. Safety. For the first time in 2 years, I'm not afraid. Let me feel this. But the village of Thornby made integration more complicated than bureaucratic paperwork suggested. Thornby held perhaps 400 souls, most of whom had lost someone to the war. The memorial in the village square listed 37 names from the Great War, another 23 from this war just ended. 60 men dead out of a population of 400. When Greta walked to the village shop with the children that first week, conversations stopped. Women turned away or stared with undisguised hostility. No one spoke to her. No one welcomed her. The third day, Elise came home crying. She'd been playing near the village green. The other children had called her Nazi, had thrown stones. Not large ones, not trying to truly hurt, but the message was clear. Greta held her daughter while she cried, and Matthias saw murder in his wife's eyes. Not literal murder, but the fierce protective rage of a mother whose child had been hurt. We should leave, Greta said that night after the children slept. Find somewhere else. Somewhere they don't know what we are. Everywhere knows what we are, Matthias replied. We can't hide from it. We can only live through it until time softens it. How long will that take? I don't know. But Thornton believes in us. We're not alone in this. The children are alone. They don't have other children to play with. They're outcasts. Then we teach them English. We help them integrate. We show the village we're not threats. We prove ourselves through behavior, not through arguments. It was the lesson Matthias had learned in Camp 185. The British way. Prove yourself through consistent action over time. So they began the slow work of integration. Matthias worked Thornton's farm 6 days a week, proving himself reliable and skilled. Greta learned English from village women who were willing to teach despite their reservations. The children attended the village school, endured bullying that gradually lessened. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn. Autumn to winter. The cottage held warmth against English cold. The family developed routines. By spring of 1947, things had shifted subtly. The village shop owner, Mrs. Pemberton, began greeting Greta by name. Good morning, Mrs. Brenner. How are the children settling? Small exchanges at first. Weather and pleasantries. Nothing deep. But acknowledgement. Stephen made his first friend, a boy named Thomas, whose uncle had died at Arnhem. The boys bonded over cricket, a sport Stephen was learning to understand. Elisa's teacher, Miss Crawford, asked Greta to help with the church jumble sale. An invitation to contribute to community life. Greta accepted, spent an afternoon sorting donated clothes and books, working alongside women who'd lost husbands and sons to Germans. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. More like pragmatic coexistence. The war was over. Hatred was exhausting. Life required moving forward. In June of 1947, William Thornton called Matthias to his farmhouse office. The old farmer looked uncertain, which was unusual for a man who'd worked the same land for 40 years. "I've been thinking," Thornton began slowly. "About the farm. About succession. I'm 66 years old. No children of my own to leave this to. Farm's been in my family 3 generations. But that dies with me unless I make different arrangements." Matthias waited, not sure where this was leading. "You're a good worker. Better than good. You understand the land. You plan ahead." Thornton pulled papers from a drawer. "I want to make you a partner. Legal partnership. Thornton and Brenner Agricultural Limited. Equal share of profits. Equal voice in decisions. Eventually option to buy me out when I retire or die." Matthias stared at the papers, unable to process what he was hearing. "You want to make me your partner? I'm German. I was your enemy. You were Germany's soldier. Not Germany itself. And you're not that anymore." Thornton pushed the papers across the desk. "I'm not doing this from kindness. I'm doing it from practicality. I need someone to carry this farm forward. You need security for your family." He paused, looking out the window at fields that had been in his family for generations. "This land has been farmed for 1,000 years. I want that to continue. You'll make sure it continues." Matthias took the papers home. That evening, he and Greta sat at their kitchen table, reading legal documents that offered them something impossible. Ownership. Partnership. A stake in British soil through legal mechanism instead of conquest. "This can't be real," Greta said, reading through the terms. "He's offering you half his farm. He wants succession. Someone to carry the farm into the next generation." Greta set down the papers, looked at Matthias with an expression he hadn't seen since before the war. Hope. Real, unguarded hope for the future. "Take it," she said firmly. "Whatever doubts you have, set them aside. Take it. Build this for our children. Give them something that isn't ruins and shame." Matthias signed the partnership papers in July 1947. Thornton and Brenner Agricultural Limited became official, registered with British authorities, recognized in law. The village did talk. Some approved. Some condemned Thornton for rewarding a German with British land. But Thornton had lived in Thornby 66 years, had earned respect through decades of fair dealing, and eventually most villagers accepted that what he did with his own property was his own business. By 1950, the Brenner family had lived in Thornby 4 years. Long enough to become familiar. Long enough that their presence no longer sparked comment. In November 1950, Greta was invited to join the Women's Institute. Membership required nomination and vote. The women of Thornby had voted to accept a German woman into their organization. Greta came home from her first meeting with tears in her eyes. "They accepted me," she told Matthias. "Mrs. Pemberton nominated me. Miss Crawford seconded. The vote was unanimous." In 1951, the Brenner family became eligible for permanent residency in Britain. They'd met all requirements. 5 years continuous residence. Steady employment. Community integration. Thornton provided sponsorship without hesitation. The paperwork was filed, approved. One more step remained. British citizenship required additional years, additional integration, and the oath of allegiance. They asked the children. Stefan and Elise were old enough now to understand what it meant. Stefan, now 12, thought for perhaps 30 seconds. I'm English. I don't remember Germany. I don't want to be German. I want to be what I feel like. And that's English. Elise, now 10, took longer. Can I be both? Can I remember Germany and be English too? You can remember your heritage, Greta said carefully. But legally, you have to choose one citizenship. Then English. Because this is home. Germany is just stories. October 1952. The Brenner family stood in a magistrate's office in York alongside 50 other applicants for British citizenship. Germans. Poles. Czechs. Displaced persons from across Europe who'd chosen Britain as their future. The oath was administered by a magistrate in formal robes, speaking words that had been spoken for centuries. I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law. Matthias spoke the words. Meant them. He was swearing allegiance to the civilization that had saved his life, had shown him what democracy actually meant, had given him and his family a future when they had none. Greta's voice joined his. The children's voices, still high and uncertain, repeating words that made them legally British. When the ceremony concluded, they walked out into autumn sunshine as British citizens. Legally. Officially. The transformation complete. William Thornton waited outside. He shook Matthias's hand formally. Congratulations. You've earned this. Then he pulled an envelope from his pocket. This is for you. The partnership papers updated. Legal transfer of my share of the farm to you upon my death or retirement. You're not just my partner anymore. You're my heir. Matthias opened the envelope with shaking hands, read the legal documents. Thornton was leaving him the farm. The land. The buildings. Everything. Why? Matthias managed. Because you've cared for it like it was yours. Because you understand what it means. Because I have no one else. The years passed quietly after that. In 1973, the Imperial War Museum contacted Matthias. They were collecting oral histories from World War II veterans and prisoners of war. Would he be willing to be interviewed? Matthias was 58 now, gray-haired, weathered by decades of farm work, thoroughly integrated into British life. He agreed. The historian who came to the farm was young, perhaps 30, born after the war, approaching these events as history rather than lived experience. Tell me about Camp 185, the historian began, tape recorder running. Matthias spoke for 3 hours, covered his capture, his time at camp, the Christmas service, the decision to stay, the slow integration into British life. When it concluded, the historian turned off the tape recorder. Sergeant Major Coleman is still alive, you know. 91 years old now. Living in Cornwall. His papers have been donated to the museum. There's a letter he wrote in December 1944 but never sent. About the cost of treating German prisoners fairly when his own son had died at Dunkirk. Would you like to see it? Very much. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. Imperial War Museum Archives, reference IWM, DOC, 1944-12-25. Matthias read it alone in his farmhouse office, his vision swimming. Tonight I watched German prisoners sing Christmas hymns while my guard stood in the rain listening. I allowed it because policy requires it. Because showing we can maintain civilized values even toward enemies proves we're better than them. But it costs me. Every day it costs me. Robert died at Dunkirk. Killed by German shells. June 1940. He was 19 years old. And I'm treating his killers with decency that would break his mother's heart if she knew the details. But if I abandon our values, if I let hatred determine my actions, then Hitler wins even if we defeat him militarily. So I maintain discipline. Enforce fairness. Treat them correctly. Not because they deserve it. Because we demand it of ourselves. Because civilization means something or it means nothing. And Robert died defending civilization. So I honor his memory by proving it was worth defending. Even when it costs me everything. Matthias wept reading that letter, understanding finally and completely the price Coleman had paid, the restraint that had saved Matthias's life and soul, understanding that British fairness hadn't been easy or natural. It had been chosen deliberately, at personal cost, as demonstration that civilization could survive war if people refused to abandon it. They met 6 months later. Two old men, former guard and former prisoner, drinking tea in Coleman's sitting room overlooking the sea, talking about the war, about choices made, about the cost of maintaining values under pressure. "You were right," Matthias said. "About everything. Treating us fairly proved Britain's superiority more effectively than cruelty would have. I'm British now because of what you showed me." Coleman smiled. 25,000 of you stayed. That's your legacy. That's Britain's legacy. In 1985, the 50th anniversary of VE Day brought renewed interest in World War II stories. The BBC produced a documentary about prisoners of war in Britain. They contacted Matthias for an interview. He was 70 now, living alone in a smaller cottage. Greta had died 3 years earlier. The main house was occupied by Stefan and his family. "What did British captivity teach you?" the interviewer asked. Matthias thought about that question for a long moment. "It taught me that real strength includes restraint. That victory doesn't require vengeance. That treating enemies with dignity when you've defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could prove. I expected torture. I received fairness. That destroyed my faith in Nazi propaganda more effectively than any beating could have. The British won the war twice. Once militarily. Once morally. The second victory mattered more." Matthias Brenner died in 2001. 86 years old. Peacefully in his sleep. The funeral filled Thornby Village Church. 3 generations of family. Neighbors. Friends. The entire community he'd been part of for 55 years. Stefan gave the main eulogy. "My father taught me that courage means admitting when you're wrong. That strength means building instead of destroying. That redemption is possible through consistent decent action over decades." The headstone went up in Thornby Churchyard the following month. Yorkshire stone. Local tradition. Marking the grave of a man who travelled impossibly far to reach this final rest. Matthias Brenner. 1915 to 2001. Teacher. Farmer. British citizen. He learned mercy from his enemies. And every year on Christmas Eve, Stefan's family gathered at the grave, sang Silent Night in German the way Matthias had sung it in Camp 185 in 1944. Sang it to remember. To honor. To pass forward the lesson that civilization means maintaining values even toward enemies. Especially toward enemies. Because that's what Matthias Brenner learned. That's what Richard Coleman taught. That's what Britain demonstrated through systematic decency toward 200,000 defeated enemies. That mercy works. That restraint demonstrates strength. That civilization survives when people refuse to abandon it, even under war's pressures, even when revenge would be easier, even when every instinct cries for vengeance. The mercy of enemies. The restraint that redeemed. The civilization that proved itself through how it treated defeated foes. Of 200,000 German prisoners of war held in Britain during World War II, 25,000 chose to remain. They proved that yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's citizens if given the chance and if they earned it through honest effort. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was what Matthias Brenner carried from cattle car to churchyard. From prisoner to citizen. From enemy to honored member of community. And it began with a British sergeant offering water to a German prisoner on a rain-soaked October morning in 1944, and choosing to treat him correctly despite having every reason not to. That choice echoed through decades. Through lives transformed. Through civilization preserved. Through mercy remembered and honored and passed forward to generations who would carry it into futures their ancestors could never have imagined. The mercy of enemies. The victory that mattered more than military defeat. The proof that civilization means something real, something measurable in human interactions, something worth preserving even at personal cost. That was what Matthias Brenner learned. That was what he lived. That was what his Yorkshire gravestone testified to for anyone with eyes to see and wisdom to understand. He learned mercy from his enemies. And that mercy changed everything.